Right now, my colleague Timothy Atena was at the launch and now he joins me live. Timothy, thank you so much for joining me. So, I mean, listening to the CJ, there's so much hope in this division. What is going to be different about it?
Well, first of all, the Chief Justice has said that he's going to be adding more magistrates to this particular division. As it stands, the Anti-Corruption and Economics Crime Division of the High Court, that will first of all only be based in Nairobi, has about 10 magistrates to it. So the Chief Justice has said in order to fight graft and the cases that are brought before this particular court, he is going to be announcing in the coming days an additional number of magistrates who are going to be sitting in this particular court to try and expedite and ensure that the backlog of cases that touch on corruption are concluded as fast as possible. If you remember, Betty, this is not the brainchild of Chief Justice David Maraga. It was actually started in January by a former Chief Justice Willie Mutunga, who placed Lady Justice Hedwig Ongudi as the presiding judge in this particular court. She is deputized by Lady Justice Lydia Achode. Now, the 12 man, or in this case woman team, of course, will get more magistrates according to the announcement made today by David Maraga. But aside from that is the issue of fast tracking the cases that touch on corruption that will be brought to this particular court. If you remember, during his grilling, Justice Maraga, one of the things that he promised to do was to ensure the speedy conclusion of cases that are brought to this particular court. And he's saying that there will be no more tolerating, so to speak, suspects who are brought before the court who feign sickness. He did particularly mention this, that normally when these high-profile individuals and high-profile cases are brought before a high court, the following day, the suspect says, he or she is not feeling well and therefore does not present himself or herself before the magistrate. And he says, unless it's a very, very serious case of illness, they're not going to be allowing any more evasion, what he terms as evasion of justice, and he's going to ensure that cases brought before the court are heard on a fast, as a matter of urgency. Now, in that regard, he did say that, of course, he is also going to stop this notion that the judiciary is stifling or trying to block the fight against corruption. Basically, based on the fact that he was saying that particularly the Director of Criminal Investigations and the police often accuse the judiciary of releasing, perhaps on bond or bail, some of the suspects who are brought before this particular court. And he was simply saying the blame game has to stop, and that once they discover that perhaps there was an issue with the prosecution and loopholes within the prosecution, then when the judges will be making their ruling, they shall be pointing this out. Remember, the judiciary is meant, of course, to uphold the tenets of the law that allows a fair hearing, and therefore he says that sometimes the prosecution side brings to court very little, insufficient evidence, enough to convict any criminal case or case touching on corruption, and therefore he's saying that the DPP needs to pull up his socks. And of course, he actually spoke directly to Kiriako Tobiko, who was at the launch, saying that he understands the challenges that the DPP faces in his office, but he really needs to pull up his socks and ensure that those brought before this court have sufficient evidence. Basically, he was saying if there is no sufficient evidence, then they will acquit. If there is sufficient evidence, then they will convict. But ultimately, he was saying the buck does not ultimately stop with the judiciary, actually saying that the judiciary is the last line in the chain to fight against corruption. But basically, he was saying the blame game needs to stop. And the fact that the judiciary sometimes acquits some of these cases that are brought before it does not mean a failure in the part of the judiciary, but perhaps means lack of sufficient evidence, and that, he was saying, falls in the docket of another agency that is meant to fight corruption and not necessarily the judiciary, Betty.
Right, Tim. I mean, it's interesting that, we're talking about blame game, but the other people who have been gravely mentioned who are frustrating these cases are the lawyers themselves, the senior lawyers, the big shot lawyers, who really frustrate the process, and, we keep having like one adjournment after another. So did he comment about that? Because that also is a problem in itself within the judiciary.
Yes, he did actually speak about those lawyers who collude with their clients to postpone and try and drag these cases for as long as they can. Of course, insisting, giving even an example that there's sometimes lawyers who book 2 cases within the same time. So the corruption case is ignored for another case that is being held at a different court. And of course, he was saying the new rules, one of the rules is that any lawyer who is, of course, defending any client in a corruption case, that corruption case will take precedence over any other case that lawyer is actually hearing. So any lawyer who is going to be representing a client in a corruption case will have to present himself before the court as well as that particular client. And he says that these are some of the radical changes that he wants to bring to ensure that these cases do not drag and that they are hard and determined as soon as possible. He actually gave a time frame that he hopes that some of these cases can be concluded within 1 month, and that if the litigants in the case have both been served with the application cases and the courts have served them with the papers, then the magistrate has to call that case to hearing as soon as possible to try and expedite this. So Betty, what you're trying to get is a sense of a Chief Justice who's already 2 months in office and is talking tough on the war against graft. Whether these rules will stand the test of time, of course, we'll be waiting to see. But of course, the legacy that Chief Justice David Maraga hopes to achieve is, of course, bring most of these high-profile cases to conclusion and hopefully conviction, which he says really lies on the investigation agencies, and of course warning lawyers who try and drag these cases too long that from now henceforth corruption cases will be will take the first priority within this particular court that will be based only in Nairobi, Betty.
And that's where I'm coming to. Finally, the fact that this court is going to be based only in Nairobi, are we likely to see some resistance on that? Because the former AG, I beg your pardon, the former CJ, Evans Gisharu, tried that, in the past, but did not work. So how is it going to work now? Will we get appeals in regards to this?
Well, the Chief Justice was saying the reason why they have decided to have this particular special branch of the High Court based solely in Nairobi is to reduce the backlog. He was saying that some of the cases that go to the other courts or chief magistrate courts across the entire country, normally applications are made by those who have been accused of engaging in corruption or economic crimes. And when an appeal is made in those particular court cases, then they have to come at a date set by the magistrates court in those particular courts across the country. And he was saying that this was the reason why some of these cases were dragging for too long, because of the backlog that are often and the huge number of cases that magistrate courts across the country experience on a daily basis. Some of these applications and appeal and court injunctions and court orders are usually have to be heard perhaps 2-3 months later. But he was saying by the fact that there is a special court that will only be in Nairobi, these application cases will no longer be heard by the magistrates court because of the fact that those courts already experience a high number of cases, and therefore some of the dates for hearing are usually dragged up to 3 months or so. But if they're brought in Nairobi in a court that specially has been set up to deal with issues of corruption, they can be prosecuted faster, and therefore the chain and this backlog rather that we see of cases can reduce. And that was the reason that he was giving in this particular case. Whether or not this will work, Betty, I believe time will tell indeed. Of course, we've seen he's a tough-talking Chief Justice in this regard. But of course, normally as it is, time usually does tell whether this will be effective. But of course, based on the comments that were made by the Attorney General who was there, as well as the Director of Public Prosecution and the Governor of the Central Bank of Kenya, who of course was here based on the fact that there is the economics crimes part of this court, of course, were expressing confidence that these new laws will really bring change and inject the much needed change in the fight against graft in the country, Betty.
All right, thank you very much, Timothy Otieno, for that excellent reporting. He's joining me from the Milimani Law Courts, where the Chief Justice, David Maraga, has just presided over the launch of the Anti-Corruption and Economic Crimes Division of the High Court. All right.